The Celts were a people of mysticism, resilience, and rich cultural heritage. For centuries, they thrived across Europe, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes through history. Despite not having a written language for much of their early existence, we have learned a surprising amount about these fascinating people through archaeology, Roman and Greek records, and the traditions that survived in oral form. We can trace how they rose to prominence, how they lived, and where their descendants can still be found today. When many people hear the word Celtic, they immediately think of Ireland, or perhaps Scotland and Wales. That impression is understandable, but far too narrow. In truth, the Celts once spanned across an immense portion of Europe. They lived in lands we now call Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland, northern Italy, Poland, Iberia, and even as far east as Thrace. Their influence was wide and diverse, yet over time much of it was absorbed or erased by powerful neighbours, most notably the Romans. Eventually, Celtic culture became concentrated in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. But their history was far more expansive than those modern associations suggest. The Celts were not a single empire, nor even a unified civilization. They were instead a loose collection of Indo-European peoples who shared similar languages, traditions, and spiritual beliefs. Unlike the Romans or Greeks, the Celts did not typically seek to form vast, centralized states. Instead, they lived in tribal societies, often independent and sometimes hostile to one another. This disunity would ultimately become both their greatest weakness and, oddly enough, one of the reasons their culture still survives in scattered regions today. Despite lacking a united empire, Celtic tribes were anything but weak. They often proved to be formidable opponents to the two great powers of the ancient world, Greece and Rome. Greek and Roman writers tended to use the term Celt or Gaul, broadly applying it to many groups who lived beyond the borders of what they considered civilized states. To them, the Celts were barbarians, yet the reality was more complex. These tribes were skilled warriors and craftsmen with their own intricate social and spiritual systems. Their way of life posed a serious challenge to the mighty Roman machine. One of the earliest and most famous clashes between Rome and the Celts came during the Gallic Wars. In 58 BC, Julius Caesar, then a Roman proconsul, embarked on a campaign in Gaul seeking military glory and political power. The Celts of Gaul were not weaklings waiting to be conquered. They had warriors who were renowned for fearlessness. Ancient accounts describe many Celtic fighters charging into battle without armor and sometimes even without clothes, believing courage alone was the greatest protection. It was a Celtic chieftain who once told Alexander the Great that his people feared nothing, not even him. In the opening stages of Caesar's campaigns, the Celtic tribes fought fiercely but separately. They had a tragic tendency to quarrel with one another, just as often as they fought external enemies. Caesar took advantage of this disunity, crushing tribe after tribe. Only later did a leader named Vercingetorix emerge to rally the Celtic forces in Gaul. As chief of the Arverni tribe, he attempted to unite the divided peoples into a single resistance. His effort was impressive, but it came too late. In 52 BC, at the Battle of Alesia, Caesar outmaneuvered the Celts, surrounding them with massive fortifications. The Gauls suffered enormous losses, and Gaul fell under Roman control. This defeat was devastating, but it was not the last time Celts would stand against Rome. Another defining moment came decades later in the British Isles. By the time the Romans under Emperor Claudius invaded Britain in 43 AD, several Celtic tribes already thrived. There, the Romans met fierce resistance from local leaders, but none more famous than Queen Boudicca of the Iceni. Initially, her tribe had a tenuous alliance with Rome during the reign of her husband Prasutagus. But after his death, Roman officials showed their ruthlessness. They seized Iceni lands, mistreated Boudicca and her daughters, and sought to strip the tribe of autonomy. Outraged, Boudicca called her people to arms. Around 60 AD, she led a massive uprising against Roman rule. With warriors from her own tribe and allies from neighboring groups, Boudicca launched devastating raids. She destroyed the Roman settlement of Camulodunum and advanced toward Londinium. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, rushed to intercept her but lacked sufficient troops. Rather than risk annihilation, he withdrew, leaving the city vulnerable. Boudicca's forces torched Londinium, reducing it to ashes. For a brief moment, it seemed the Celts had turned the tide, yet Rome was never quick to surrender. Paulinus regrouped his legions and rebuilt his strength. Despite being heavily outnumbered, with perhaps 10,000 Romans facing more than 200,000 Celtic warriors, the Romans used disciplined strategy and superior equipment to their advantage. In a decisive battle, they annihilated Boudicca's army, ending the rebellion. The queen herself is said to have taken her own life rather than fall into enemy hands. Though defeated, Boudicca became a lasting symbol of Celtic defiance and courage. Despite the setbacks of Gaul and Britain's Celtic culture did not vanish overnight. Pockets of independence survived, especially in Ireland and parts of Scotland which remained beyond the reach of Roman conquest. Even in lands controlled by Rome, local Celtic customs survived beneath the surface, often blending with Roman traditions. Over time, however, in much of continental Europe, Celtic identity faded under the weight of Romanization and later waves of migration. Yet in the British Isles, the Celtic spirit endured. After the Romans withdrew in the 5th century, the tribes and peoples of Britain and Ireland continued to shape their own paths. The Celts never formed a single unified nation, but their influence lived on in art, music, mythology, and language. The swirling patterns of Celtic knotwork, the legends of druids and heroes, the haunting melodies of traditional instruments, all testify to a culture that refused to vanish. In modern times, the legacy of the Celts is strongest in what are called the 6 Celtic nations. These are Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and the Isle of Man. In these places, Celtic languages and traditions remain part of daily life, though often endangered. For example, Irish Gaelic is spoken by more than 200,000 people as a first language and learned by many more. Scottish Gaelic counts tens of thousands of speakers, while Welsh boasts hundreds of thousands. Breton, Cornish and Manx have fewer speakers, but revitalization movements continue to keep them alive. The endurance of Celtic culture raises an important question. Should we even use the term Celt to describe such a wide variety of tribes who were never politically unified? Some scholars argue that it oversimplifies the diversity of those peoples. Yet the survival of related languages and shared traditions suggests that there was and still is a real cultural bond. Organizations such as the Celtic League and International Celtic Congress promote awareness and cooperation among modern Celtic communities. Festivals, music and art inspired by Celtic themes continue to thrive across the world. Far from being a vanished people, the Celts adapted by blending with surrounding societies while maintaining unique elements of their heritage. Genetic research confirms that Celtic ancestry remains widespread in regions once inhabited by their tribes. Many today feel a deep pride in identifying with those ancient roots. Ironically, the very disunity that prevented the Celts from building an empire may have helped preserve them. Because they scattered and formed small independent communities, conquerors never managed to stamp them out completely. The story of the Celts is not one of disappearance, but of transformation. From warriors who terrified Rome to artists whose patterns still inspire design, their influence stretches across millennia. They may not have built sprawling cities like the Romans or written epics like the Greeks, but they carved their mark in a different way. They lived close to the land, valued honor and courage, and carried traditions that continue to shape the identity of entire nations today. The Celts remind us that history is not only written by the conquerors. Sometimes it is carried in the songs, spoken in the old languages still taught to children. It is woven into art, carved into stones, and remembered in legends passed from one generation to the next. And so the Celts, though changed, remain alive in spirit, identity, and culture. Their story continues, not as a closed chapter, but as a living tradition that still resonates across the world.